Hello, I'm Ben Orchard.
And I'm Claire Fitzpatrick.
Welcome to Sword, Sorcery and Synthesizers, the 80s fantasy movie podcast. I'm coming to you from Adelaide.
And I'm in Brisbane.
But through the wonders of modern technology and the magic of Skype, we meet each week to discuss some beloved movie of a bygone era and see what lies behind the nostalgia. Yeah. Hello, listeners.
Hello.
We haven't dropped off the face of the earth, although it's been weeks since we've recorded anything. It's more been a case of real life getting in the way. We've both had sort of family difficulties that have, kept us from recording, work troubles. My computer was hacked, by Russian hackers, and I, barely managed to, stop them from clearing out my bank account. Claire, meanwhile, has had to brace for the impact of a cyclone, literally.
Yes. Although my house is still here, and I have not been squished by a house. Anything like that. But it's all good. It's come and it is gone. That's what I get for living in a tropical area.
So yeah, there were lots of things that we planned to discuss, but didn't get around to. We were talking about, doing episodes based on like The Princess Bride or Willow, given that the film star Val Kilmer has recently passed away. We thought of doing that as a tribute to him. In the lead up to Easter, we were thinking of talking about Last Temptation of Christ. We had a whole lot of ideas we were floating, but yeah, we just couldn't get around to recording it, unfortunately.
These things happen, though. But we are back.
Well, I thought that we'd do something a little bit different today, because one thing that we've been, I guess, that's been a recurring theme on this podcast as we talk about various different 80s fantasy films. We've often, spent some time discussing the soundtracks and the impact that music has in the context of a film.
And it's so incredibly important for both of us. Like, we both are music aficionados, and I was a music journalist for many years, and I listen to music every single day. So yes, it really stands out when we're watching films.
Yes, music has a way of soothing my tortured soul a lot of the time. And, during the last couple of sort of really stressful weeks when we haven't been able to record, I have been listening to various soundtracks. I often have like special soundtrack albums that I listen to outside the context of the film, in isolation from the film. Often, sometimes as background music for when I'm doing other things. Things that aren't very dramatic, like household chores a lot of the time. Or I listen to it when I'm, jogging or, commuting on the bus. So instead of talking about one specific film and picking it apart like we usually do, I thought what might be fun is if we, look back on our top 5 soundtracks.
Which is awesome.
What I've ended up doing is I've come up with like a list of my top 5 80s fantasy movie soundtracks, just to keep things on brand for the podcast. And I've come up with 5 favorite soundtracks that are not 80s fantasy films. And I believe you've just come up with your like top 5 list of soundtracks in general.
I have. So I have 5 films. However, they're actually one is 80s, two are in the 90s and two are in the early 2000s. So I feel like it's not, it's far enough back that it's still, it's, not all in the 80s, but it's not like everything happened, it didn't come out yesterday. So, there's still, I guess, nostalgia to a lot of the music, and I do have nostalgic feelings towards it and the movies and, why I chose it. So, still on brand with nostalgia.
With regards to my pick, I thought what makes a favorite? And with each of these, I picked a soundtrack that I've listened to the music in isolation as an album more times than I've seen the film itself. I've tried to pick music that I think stands apart from the movie as being, particularly interesting. And there are a few cases where I've picked, soundtrack albums where I think the music is actually like more memorable or grand than the film it was designed to accompany, actually.
I've actually got one of those as well. And when I list them of what they are, people who have seen this particular film will know instantly why the soundtrack is better than the film itself. Much more memorable.
Well, how about we take this point by point? Like, you can give me your number 5, counting up to number 1, and then I can give you like my number 5, or like my equivalent choice on my lists that I've made. What's your number 5? What's your number 5, Claire?
Candyman soundtrack.
Now, just to be clear, this is the soundtrack to the original 90s film Candyman by Bernard Rose, the one with the Philip Glass score.
So, yeah, specifying that, I know there was a Candyman that came out 2 years ago now. Was it? I think, not sure, which is still good.
What I haven't seen the most recent Candyman movie. What's confusing to me is I've heard that it's not a remake, but actually a sequel.
Yes.
But it still just has the single word title, Candyman.
Yes, I actually think it's really great as a standalone movie. Just as a side note, I think it's really good. But I definitely don't think it should have been called Candyman because it's a bit confusing. And when you're watching it, you're like, this is actually a sequel or not a direct remake, but yeah. Good music in that too, but the original Candyman really stands out to me, of course, for the soundtrack and the music.
I actually own an album called Music from Candyman, which contains the music that Philip Glass did for both the first Candyman movie in the 90s that Bernard Rose directed and the sequel that came immediately after that by Bill Condon called Candyman Farewell to the Flesh, which was also kind of a prequel because it included flashbacks to the Candyman's life as a mortal man.
Yeah.
And yes, generally I think that, Glass's score is so eerie with its combination of sort of, I don't know, music box arpeggios and, the sort of eerie vocalese sort of choir, chanting.
I actually have it on like vinyl. I ordered it online. I saw it come out and I was like, wow, that would sound really good on vinyl. I think that's gonna be really atmospheric. And it does. It sounds amazing.
The thing about Philip Glass, if I may make an observation, is that he's a minimalist composer. And by design, his music is structured in a very repetitive way. And I often find like some of his long form compositions and like his symphonies and his operas, hard to get into because they are so repetitive. But with a lot of his soundtrack work, because like the music has to fit precisely with the length of a given scene, they're a bit more focused and disciplined. And that's the case with Candyman. I think also, especially some of the music he wrote for the second film, which is included on the album along with the music he wrote from the first film. Yeah. There's a surprisingly like warm, romantic love theme for the flashback scenes to the Candyman's mortal life.
Yeah. Well, one of the notes that they made, like one of the observations was, I think it's like Annie's theme.
Yeah.
Yeah. really lovely. It's a beautiful piece, and I think if you played it for someone and you know they probably guess that it's from some kind of love film or something that's a bit more lighthearted, not Candyman. I think it's a gorgeous piece. I think obviously like one of the most well known is like Helen's theme. Um and that's probably if people are gonna say, you know, the Candyman theme, they'd probably hear that in their heads. Or at least that's me, what I would hear. It's very creepy.
It's creepy, but what I find unique about Candyman is it's one of the most melodic horror movie scores I've ever heard.
Yes.
It doesn't have many sort of harsh dissonant passages, which a lot of like horror movies of the time when it was made, a lot of horror movies of that time period do have these very sort of harsh, dissonant, sort of shrieking string effects, and that's not really present in Candyman. It's much more eerie and like it gently creeps up on you.
Hmm. The only song I would probably say that is a bit more dissonant in Candyman is I think it's called Face to Razor, which is pretty scary. It's happens I'm trying to think of where it happens in the scene, but if you do listen to it, it's much more it's much more unsettling, and I think it's a really good contrast to the hauntingly beautiful pianos to the rest of the film. But it still works. It's so, yeah, atmospheric and full of tension.
All right, if I can pick something from my list that's sort of an equivalent to Candyman,
Yeah.
in the sense that it's one of those sort of gently melodic compositions that sort of washes over you and sort of quietly, you know, works its way into your consciousness. There's the soundtrack that the sort of Irish New Age folk group Clannad did for the TV series Robin of Sherwood. They released it as an album under the title Legend. The Clannad soundtrack was for the British television production of Robin Hood that really emphasized the sort of mystical elements of British folklore. This was a Sherwood forest that, you know, was full of spirits and, you know, witches, and there were all these sort of mythical elements thrown in. The supernatural existed alongside, you know, various real world historical figures that would, you know, show up throughout the series. And the soundtrack that they did was recorded at a time when Clannad was, I don't know, at a transition point in their career. They started out as more of a traditional folk band, and then they sort of transitioned into being like a new agey pop crossover group, I suppose, with more sort of electronic elements added into their music. I mean, this would have been a time shortly after Enya left the group and pursued like her own solo career along a similar bent in terms of that kind of mystical, new agey sort of crossover sound that still had some slight elements of Celtic folk music. But yeah, the soundtrack that they did for Robin of Sherwood is very eerie and haunting, a lot of it. The main theme, Robin the Hooded Man, is just sort of like the chanting of a few very simple phrases. And there's a romantic motif for Maid Marian that's played on the harp, and that's also, you know, quite haunting. But every now and then there's some sort of, I mean, there's a more sort of aggressive, percussive, like action motif called Battle. And the motifs for the forest spirits, the Darkmere and Herne, these are, you know, have much more of a sort of sinister vibe to them. The tracks don't jump out at you immediately, and they sort of flow into each other. It's the kind of like music where, well, I've just listened to it like lying back on a couch, sort of, and just listen to the whole album straight through from beginning to end, because it's only like 35 minutes long or something. I think it's under 40 minutes long anyway in the original pressing of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, just sort of let myself be gently carried away by the music in a sort of meditative way.
That actually makes me think of Enchant by Emily Autumn. You know, the idea that you are relaxed and gently carried away with the music and you sort of just listen to it and allow it to sort of, overcome you in a good way.
The other thing I wrote on my list of like non-fantasy soundtracks, my top 5 non-80s fantasy soundtracks, is actually something that also featured Clannad. They did one song on this soundtrack, Last of the Mohicans. That's the 1992 film of Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis and Madeline Stowe. It was directed by Michael Mann. Clannad did this like really eerie, haunting song called "I Will Find You," which is basically the motif for Hawkeye when he's resolving to come to the rescue of the woman he loves. The main soundtrack, though, there were like 2 composers because it was a kind of a troubled production that was cut and recut in post-production. And the director, Michael Mann, was a bit unsure about what kind of music he wanted. So, yeah, half of the score is by Trevor Jones, and his part of it is very epic in terms of its sweeping strings and orchestral melodies, mixed in with these very sprightly, Gaelic folk reels. And these end up being incorporated into the action sequences. The way that some of the scenes are cut, especially the finale that takes place on this like huge promontory. Yeah, the rhythms of the music and the dynamics of the imagery are cut so closely together.
Oh, I remember watching it years ago when you sent it to me, and I haven't watched it for quite a long time. But I do recall thinking that it was very epic. The soundtrack was very immersive. And I remember thinking that it just sort of like carried the story along. You know what I mean? Like everything sort of was in its right place. And it was just really, really good. Yeah.
The other half of Last of the Mohicans was composed by a guy called Randy Edelman, and his contributions generally don't get focused on quite as much because they are more subdued and intimate. He sort of mixes acoustic guitars that have land sort of folky melodies in with like some of the more mellow love themes. And in their own way, I think they're just as beautiful.
But that's what makes really successful soundtracks. So there are so many different elements when isolated can seem like they don't belong together at all. However, when it all works really well, seamlessly, every single element comes together and that makes like a really beautiful like piece all through the film.
So, what's your next pick? What's number 4 on your list?
Okay, so I had Donnie Darko.
Donnie Darko was a film that was made in 2001 but set in the 1980s.
Yes, I think it's awesome. So actually, when I first watched Donnie Darko, I think I was maybe 13, 14, around that time. That was sort of when I was sort of getting into a lot of different types of music. And when I first listened to this, when I first watched it, I ended up listening to the soundtrack. And that's when I really started paying attention to soundtrack and really started paying attention to music and score and films. So yeah, if anyone who's seen it, it's mainly got sort of like 80s new wave kind of classics that you would know.
There's a couple of things that stand out to me. There's a sort of mellow piano ballad cover of Tears for Fears song, Mad World. The version on Donnie Darko is performed by Gary Jules. And for people who are soundtrack aficionados, there's a song called Stay by Oingo Boingo. And for those who don't know, the frontman of the band, the Oingo Boingo, was Danny Elfman, who would later go on to specialize in composing soundtrack music himself. Mainly most of the films that Tim Burton directed, Danny Elfman did the soundtrack for, including one that we talked about previously on the podcast called Beetlejuice.
Which is really interesting that he was in that, because I don't think a lot of people know that. But I think what I love about it is that it has such a great combination of, 80s new wave, but also a lot of, like piano and string pieces that are quite haunting, actually. It's like I love like Killing Moon by Echo and the Morning Band.
I'd say that the soundtrack to Donnie Darko is like a soundtrack of 2 halves. There's all of these pop songs from the 80s that sort of establish the time period that the film is set in. And then there's the instrumental score, which is sort of, as you say, more mellow, more classical sounding. And that really underscores like the unspoken emotions of the characters.
Yeah. And they have like the called like Fourth Dimension and For Whom the Bell Tolls, which are very, very melancholy music. It's just instrumental, very creepy and very atmospheric. But and then I think it's actually really interesting how that instrumental kind of then flows into other music. So you've got then the piece that's called Did You Know Him at the end, and then that doesn't have any lyrics, and then that flows into Mad World by Garrett Jules. So I actually really like the way that the orchestral and just musical elements flow into songs with lyrics. I think it's done really well.
Yeah, I agree, and I can see why it's a favorite. Actually, you mentioning Donnie Darko neatly sort of segues into one of the pieces, one of the film's soundtracks on my list of 80s fantasy movie soundtracks. In Donnie Darko, there's a scene where the main character goes to a movie theater and they're showing The Last Temptation of Christ. One of the soundtracks that I've got on my list is The Last Temptation of Christ by Peter Gabriel, which was actually, it wasn't released under that title. It was released as a studio album under the title Passion. I think because Gabriel had decided to sort of elaborate and expand on some of the themes. So yeah, some of the pieces featured on the album aren't exactly like you'd hear in the film itself. Yeah, Peter Gabriel's soundtrack to The Last Temptation of Christ is this really peculiar world music fusion album. What he basically did was he took various different folk pieces from all around the sort of Middle East and Africa and sort of combined them with all of these sort of atmospheric electronic textures. So you have all of these like exotic woodwind and percussion and string instruments from the area where, the film is set, from Israel basically. And you have these mixed in with like choral chanting from like various parts of Africa and some folk pieces that actually are from a different time period to the time that the story's set, and mixed in with all this because, it's Peter Gabriel and he's a mad prog wizard. He throws in electric guitars, synthesizers and drum machines because, what movie about Jesus would be complete without those things?
But that's so cool though, because it also, I think, adds to how weird the film is, especially when, judged by critics and people who like it as well. That's definitely something that the first thing within their mind is the soundtrack to, a weird story about Jesus.
Peter Gabriel's soundtrack was controversial for different reasons because I guess, Peter Gabriel was a white Englishman and a lot of his sort of dabbling in world music sort of, raises the question of where cultural exchange ends and when cultural appropriation begins.
Yeah.
And he draws upon like religious traditions that aren't merely Christian. The most controversial part of the film musically, I suppose, is the Last Supper sequence, which is the music that he provided for the Last Supper sequence is basically instrumental like variations on themes from the Muslim call to prayer. It's quite a beautiful piece, and I think it fits well with the sort of melancholy of the scene.
Yeah.
But I understand for a lot of people, it was like a step too far.
But I think that's why it's interesting with music itself being an accompaniment to a film. It's kind of like it's an extra character. It's an extra presence. So I can understand why people who already think that this film is just too much, then you add this extra music that is it is so harsh when you try and compare it to the subject and the themes of the film. Like, how could you have music that has nothing to do with this era or is a clash of religious things, cultural differences? So, but I think that's what makes it so interesting and so bold as well to do that, and very thought-provoking.
Well, I'm a huge Peter Gabriel fan, and one of the reasons I am a fan of him is that he takes risks, he experiments, and that he moves outside of his comfort zone to explore like different cultural traditions that are, a world apart from the place he grew up in.
Yeah.
And I just think that these kind of cultural exchanges are a good thing and that they can foster understanding between different cultures. And I think that in many cases, like I found out about like musicians from different countries that I wouldn't have otherwise, just because they collaborated with Peter Gabriel on various projects. His soundtrack to The Last Temptation of Christ was, eye-opening in many ways. And a lot of it's just very beautiful music. I mean, there are parts of it that are very melancholy, parts of it that are very eerie, parts of it that I can only describe as, creepy as fuck. But there's also parts of it that are very like triumphant and optimistic, and I really love it.
Isn't that how you describe the Bible? Creepy as fuck, and parts that are triumphant and optimistic.
Yeah, I think you can describe the Bible as a mixture of like creepy and inspirational. I think that's fair. I was going to mention, before we move on with your list, one other thing on my list of like non-fantasy movie soundtracks that is also could be considered an example of cultural appropriation and also has some religious themes. A soundtrack by the Italian composer Ennio Morricone called The Mission. The film is set in the 18th century and is about the conflict between Spanish and Portuguese slave traders and Jesuit missionaries in South America, around the Iguazu Falls area, sort of on the border of what is, now Brazil and Argentina.
I'm guessing the music for that would be quite interesting because that's such a very serious kind of, theme. Like, it's very serious and important, but yeah, thematically quite grand, I guess.
The Mission is a film about the clash of cultures. And the way Ennio Morricone scored that is he combined various like native percussion and woodwind instruments from South America with majestic choral pieces that were like church music of the time period, and also some flamenco guitar flourishes and these very sort of, Baroque style orchestral pieces as well. It's quite a surprise coming from Ennio Morricone, who's best known for probably the spaghetti western that he did in the 60s and 70s, like A Fistful of Dollars and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And maybe for some of the sort of more romantic, sort of string-based music that he did for art house Italian films like Cinema Paradiso. But yeah, his music for The Mission is something else. It's such a complex melting pot of different elements from different cultures. It's frankly amazing. It was sort of more successful on the charts as a crossover piece than the film itself was. The film itself got very mixed reviews and didn't turn a profit at the box office, I don't think. And the music that Morricone composed for it, a lot of it ended up like being reused in shampoo commercials. Believe it or not, I remember a shampoo commercial from the 90s where like the inspirational music that plays when the main character sort of, renounces a life of violence and joins the tribe or whatever is the same music that they had some model tossing her golden locks is saying, "Look how shiny my hair is."
So when I go to wash my hair, tomorrow morning, I'll suddenly think of like this grand epic kind of war going on.
Right. Who knows? Maybe. What's next on your list?
I have The Crow. So the 1994 film of The Crow. The one Brandon Lee.
The one with Brandon Lee, yeah.
Yes. It is one of my favorite films. Like, a favorite? God, it's so hard. Like, I just love The Crow so much. And one of the main things that I love about it is the music. So I said it before, I'll say it again, soundtrack music is everything to me, especially in films. I think it really sets the tone and to everything in the film. And I'm going to say it envelops your soul. Like, the music is just amazing. And I still listen to it regularly now. Like, it's the soundtrack and individual songs.
The soundtrack to The Crow, there's actually two soundtracks. There's a collection of songs.
Yes.
And there's also an instrumental score by Graham Revell.
Yeah. So, yes, I mean both. So, I mean, there's the songs and the instrumental as well. Mainly the song that I listen to quite often. But every now and then I will listen to the instrumental as well. Just because it often pops up on my Spotify, like, recommended. Because it's like, you've been listening to the soundtrack of this? Have you thought about listening to this instrumental?
It's been a while since I've either, seen The Crow or listened to the soundtrack. So my memory is a bit hazy. Do you have any, particular favorite tracks from The Crow?
Yeah, so there's a ballad in it, which is It Can't Rain All the Time, and it's by Canadian singer, is it Jane Seabury or Seabury? I'm not really sure how to pronounce her name, but it's beautiful and it's very sweet and melodic. And I think a lot of people, maybe when they think of The Crow, think more, industrial rock and things like that, which it does. It does have a lot of that. But this is very beautiful. And it really stands out to me as showing the sweetness, the sweet side to like Eric and like Shelley in the relationships. But I find it really interesting as well because the Stone Temple Pilots are a very popular, I don't know, new metal band. Oh God, Stone Temple Pilots are going to hear that. They're going to get angry at me. A rock. They actually changed one of their songs after Brandon Lee passed away from the gunshot accident that happened during filming. So they were actually going to have the song called Only Dying, which is a beautiful song, very melodic, very haunting, actually. But then they ended up putting in Big Empty, which is a bit more upbeat. Possibly, probably because Brandon Lee did die. But I found that interesting because I think that would have changed the movie quite a lot, actually. Yeah, The Crow is just a really good film, and it's also just like very sensual and just sexy as well. I think a lot of it is. It's really good.
You mentioned The Crow, and it sort of ties into one of the soundtracks on my list, which features an instrumental score by Graham Revell. It features a whole bunch of songs as well, including one by Jane Siberry, which she sings as a duet with Katie Lang. The soundtrack is Until the End of the World. It's this really bizarre road movie from the early 90s that's, it's set in the far off, futuristic world of 1999, where cars have talking GPS systems installed, where people have these like mobile telephones that are capable of doing video calls, where there are search engines that can locate streets using satellite photography. And towards the end of the film, there's this chilling vision of people becoming addicted to watching playback of themselves on portable electronic devices. They become so addicted that they become desensitized to the beauty of the natural world around them, and they become distracted from, other people that are trying to interact with them in the real world. I mean, a lot of people at the time thought it was a pretty far-fetched vision of the future. Unfortunately, we're living in it now.
Which is so weird. Like, you think of people who are recording like TikTok videos and they're walking across the street and they're filming things and it's like cars are coming but they're so desensitized, distracted by reality. They're so caught up in that highly sensualized kind of glamour.
I mean, I don't want to oversell how prophetic the movie was. I mean, there's a lot of things it got wrong. I mean, it presents a vision of the future where you can record people's dreams and where fedora hats have come back into fashion again. That last bit I wish would happen. Yeah, the vision of the music that plays over the course of this film, which basically the director of this film, Wim Wenders, had a list of his favorite musicians, and he sort of reached out to them and said, can you come up with music that you think, is what people will be listening to in 1999? And, well, yeah, the people he approached who, came back and, did like original songs for him. There was Jane Siberry and Katie Lang. I mentioned them. Their song "Calling All Angels" is a really beautiful, haunting ballad. But he also approached Talking Heads, REM, Nick Cave, Elvis Costello, Robbie Robertson, Peter Gabriel, him again. Even U2 are on board. and I know that you find them very self-indulgent at times, but they're actually on their best behavior here. And
I can appreciate them when they're on the best behavior.
well, in any case, yeah, all of this very eclectic range of musicians were brought on board to write original songs. And as a sort of connective thread in between them is Graham Revell's score, which is mostly based on themes for solo cello, with some sort of electronic textures thrown in, as well as like samples of pygmy tribes singing as well.
That's so weird.
It's sort of uncanny in the sense that it like draws on past traditions, but sounds very like uniquely alien and new. So it kind of fits with the uncanny sort of retro future vision of the world that the film has.
Yeah, no,
But
that's cool. I think also because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, so it could be anything really. It could be these snatches of, Pygmy tribe music mixed with electronic. No. Cool.
But yeah, I love the songs for this. If you're a Talking Heads fan, like the last song that they ever did as a band before breaking up was a film called Sax and Violins for Until the End of the World, which is a real banger of a song. And Nick Cave's song I'll Love You Until the End of the World is unique because like I've heard Nick Cave be tenderhearted and I've heard Nick Cave be utterly unhinged. But this song on this soundtrack is the one time I've seen him be both, like unhinged and tenderhearted. Like it's such an extravagant expression of love and devotion for this woman. And it sort of fits as well because at the heart of like the film Until the End of the World, there's this really obsessive, destructive love triangle.
I've listened to a few of his songs. I'm not like fully versed in all of his stuff, but from what I listen to, I know that he's into those obsessive kind of weird love stories, tragic, or, don't always work out, end in death, things like that. But he has such a beautiful, gloomy, haunting voice. So I think it's perfect for this.
Another standout for me, the film director David Lynch recently passed away, and he's been greatly mourned by cinephiles on social media. I've noticed one thing that's not as well known about David Lynch is that as well as being a film director, he was also a music producer, and he produces one of the songs on Until the End of the World soundtrack, a very haunting and eerie cover of an Elvis Presley song called Summer Kisses, Winter Tears. And it's performed by Julie Cruz, who is a crooner who featured in David Lynch's TV series Twin Peaks as well. So yeah, if you're a fan of the Twin Peaks soundtrack or Julie Cruz or David Lynch, like, yeah, you should check this soundtrack out as well. And yeah, as I said, the U2 song Until the End of the World is sort of one of the like better works from their 90s career. I think because like they're focused on like writing about characters and writing about the characters' emotional journey. They're not like writing about themselves and their own sort of, bleeding heart political sentiments, which I know you find very tedious. And
don't tell Bono. Come phone me.
Well, yeah, Depeche Mode is also on this. It's a real embarrassment of riches. Like even like there are a couple of songs that didn't make it onto the soundtrack, but are made it into the film. I mentioned Robbie Robertson's "Breaking the Rules" is a really haunting ballad, and that didn't appear on the soundtrack album, but it would later appear on his album Storyville, which is a great listen. It's sort of an ode to like the red light district of New Orleans. Most of it. It's a very atmospheric album, but also Peter Gabriel did a song called Blood of Eden, which didn't make it onto the soundtrack, but it made it onto his next album Us, which is, yeah, as I said, I'm a huge Peter Gabriel fan, and like I think Us is actually his masterpiece of all the albums he's done. I think it's his best, and it's Us. Us is actually an interesting companion piece to Last Temptation of Christ as well, because it sort of combines some of the like Eastern elements of that with his sort of pop sensibility. There are a few other songs on the Us album that sound like they could have been outtakes from Last Temptation of Christ with words laid on top. I'm thinking of the songs Love to Be Loved and Secret World.
Well, I can see that because Us was the first album of his that you sent me. And he said it's the first one that I listened to. And I can totally see that there's like a bit of like a crossover. Like, and yeah, there were some songs on that I was like, oh, these are really cool. And like I'll listen to some things and be like, these are good for soundtracks. And then you find out that they actually are on soundtracks. I'm just like, oh, these standalone really good songs are just awesome.
Yeah. And to move away from Until the End of the World, just briefly touch upon one other soundtrack on my sort of 80s fantasy list that is a mixture of like score and songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't go into it too much because I talked about it at length in a previous episode we did, was the soundtrack to Highlander.
Yeah.
And if you want to get hold of this, like you actually have to get 2 albums, unfortunately. There's a compilation of like the scores for the first 3 Highlander films. And it's got Michael Kamen's instrumental score for the first Highlander movie, which has, great swashbuckling flair and is like a great mix of like acoustic guitar and like grandiose sweeping strings. And then there's the songs that Queen wrote for Highlander, which are featured on their album A Kind of Magic. You know that Queen can really bring it when it comes to anthemic, like fist pumping, stadium rock, and like the song they did for Highlander, Princes of the Universe, is one of their like most stirring anthems. But there's also some like melancholy romantic ballads in there, like Who Wants to Live Forever and 1 Year of Love, which are just as memorable in their own way. And there's this really deranged song that's like the anthem for the villain, the Kurgan, called Gimme the Prize, which is just, Freddie Mercury was never a very subtle vocalist at the best of times, but, to hear him do a villain song where he just goes completely off the handle, it's something else.
That sounds pretty cool. Sounds so random, but yeah, awesome.
Anyway, what's next on your hit list, Claire?
So I have the Queen of the Damned soundtrack.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I was gonna just start with that, but I was like, oh, I'm gonna work my way up to it. I'm a massive Anne Rice fan. I started reading her work when I was like late teenager. Love it. Book's great. Movie as an adaptation, complete trash. Okay, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Everyone knows it's a fact. It's literally a fact of life that it's complete trash. However, I mean, it's actually pretty good as like if it's got nothing to do with Queen of the Damned. It's great. It's a great fun time. However, the soundtrack it's always in lists of like the best soundtracks of these types of movies, like alternative films. It's just amazing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Jonathan Davis of Korn was the mastermind behind the Queen of the Damned soundtrack. Both the songs for the soundtrack and the score.
Yeah.
And just to clarify a few points, The Queen of the Damned is an adaptation of the second and the third book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series of novels. The first book in that series was Interview with the Vampire, which got quite a faithful film adaptation in 1994 by Neil Jordan. Yes, Queen of the Damned is such an extremely loose adaptation. It's like they took the names of a few characters and a few basic concepts and then just basically did their own thing with it. I tend to think of Queen of the Damned as like a 2-hour like new metal rock video, basically, like a 2-hour music video in some ways.
That's all it is. That's literally what it is, and it's so sensual and sexy and cool. But one of the things that I really like about it that I find really interesting. So obviously, Jonathan Davis of Korn, he covered a few of the songs, because he was going to play it himself. But there's actually limitations with his record deal with Sony. So he couldn't actually have his voice appear on disc. So disc as in CDs and things like that. And so he couldn't actually release any of this music himself. So what he decided to do was get some friends of his, some buddies in other similar kind of sounding bands, to do versions of his songs. And so, they decided to do it. They all got together. And what I think is amazing. And the thing is, like, my favorite in it is his song Forsaken, and it's actually sung by David Raymond from Disturbed. I'm not a massive Disturbed fan, but I think it's so awesome. It's so gloomy and angsty, and it's just really fun.
Yes, perfect for the character of Lestat, like the original emo boy.
Gloomy, angsty, fun. But one of the things I will mention that I found so interesting is that so the late singer Alia, she actually passed away just after she completed her scenes in a plane crash, actually, which is
Well, yeah,
crazy.
well, she acts in the film. She doesn't sing on the soundtrack.
Yeah, so that's what I thought was interesting, that she was a very popular R&B singer, but wasn't singing on the soundtrack. But what I realized later was that in an interview, Jonathan Davis said that they had planned for her to actually do some music, not like a major thing, because this was more based on her like acting skills and acting abilities. But yeah, they'd planned to get at least one song, or at least her to have some kind of vocals, but obviously they couldn't because she passed away. I was reading somewhere that he kind of felt a bit uncomfortable getting snippets of the voice from other things, so that's why she's not in it. But yeah, I think again, the film, just who even knows what's happening in this movie. The music itself is amazing.
Well, the film is about a vampire who decides to become a rock star, and his music is supposedly so awesome and ravey. It raises the dead. It brings the original queen of the vampires like rising from her grave. Yeah. I'll just say this: I like the music on the soundtrack, but it's not quite that good.
Exactly. I like Korn, but Jonathan Davis, I'm sorry, I don't think you're going to raise the dead.
I mean, there's one song on there I really like called "Not Meant for Me." I can't remember who sings it though.
Well, yes, that's Wayne Static from Static X.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was actually really into his stuff when I was like a teenager. Not so much now, but that was something when people were like, who sings that? And I'm like, it's Wayne Static. But it's really cool. Like, I think just the music itself, what I love about it is that it knows it's a concept. And when you think about it, it's more like a concept album. It's a concept film because all the songs fit really well. And there actually are some moments of really like beautiful, creepy pieces, which are just instrumental. But then you have this harsh, garish kind of like electronic kind of new metal kind of music that I think really just makes the movie go from this is the lamest thing I've ever seen to this is pretty lame. But man, I can't stop watching it because the music makes it's like it tells you must love this. It's like the music is so good that you just stop seeing all the flaws in the movie. And I think it's just one of the rare instances where the soundtrack is better than the movie. And it's just a universal worldwide fact. We all agree.
I have a couple of things left on my lists, and they're both sort of films you could argue the soundtrack is better than the film itself.
Yeah.
So I'll just list these off, and then you can, round things off with whatever's left on your list.
Yeah.
One of them is something that we talked about in a previous episode. So I won't go into too much detail about that. It is Basil Poledouris' soundtrack to Conan the Barbarian, which, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Polydouris, I don't know. And the music he did for Conan is it's so grand and epic, and like on par with a lot of like, I don't know, the most grandiose classical music I've ever heard. Like the theme Riders of Doom, when the raiders are coming to burn Conan's village, and there's this choral chanting. It's up there with Carl Orff's like O Mio Fortuna to me. And there's this really elegant like waltz theme when Conan and his sidekick are like traveling from one town to another. And there's this really delicate, tender-hearted love theme that's played on woodwind instruments, and another sort of elegant piece that plays during an orgy of all things. But yeah, it is this really wonderful, like supremely elegant classical piece. And I remember you saying to me that you were writing notes as you were watching Conan the Barbarian for the first time in preparation for us to do our previous podcast episode on it, and that you wrote down in big letters like, "This music is better than the film deserves."
Yes, I did. Because I was like, okay, I really like the film. I think it's really fun. But the music is beautiful. I was like, well, how? It just seems like it's just too big for Conan. It seems like it's just way too big, and it's just not saying he was overly ambitious, but it's like, you're so talented.
I think
This is too big.
I think it's just that the music is very sophisticated, and the character of Conan is such a meathead. It seems like such an odd match on the face of it, but I think it works. The other one that I'm mentioning in a similar vein is a soundtrack by Hans Zimmer and Lebo M from a rather obscure film from the 90s called The Power of One, which is based upon a Bryce Courtney novel about this young boy who survives this horrendous boarding school in apartheid South Africa and grows up to be a boxer and a political activist. Like, a common criticism of both the novel and the film is that the sort of underdog against the odds sporting heroics kind of sit uneasily alongside all of the like political commentary about the oppression of apartheid and the violent brutality that went on during that time. And I can see the point that the critics are making, but I still find it a very touching, inspirational story. And part of that is the music that is for the film version, which mostly consists of sort of traditional sounding African choral chanting. It was like, these were pieces originally written for the film, but they sound like they could be like traditional folk pieces from the South African region. And they have that sort of timeless quality to them. Hans Zimmer and Lebo M would later collaborate again on the score for The Lion King, which is sort of a lighter, variant on the kind of music that they did for The Power of One.
Yeah, yeah.
Like The Power of One has the same kind of, I don't know, majestic sweep and sort of, soaring choral passages. But, because it's like an adult film focused on the injustices of apartheid, and like even the inspirational elements of the film are focused on, a sport that's as rough as boxing. So if you want something that sounds a bit like The Lion King but has a darker, more adult feel to it, then The Power of One is quite an interesting listen.
That's so interesting, because I love the music of The Lion King, and a lot of people it's not that it's too good for the film again, but it's very well known soundtrack. It's very popular, so that's like, because I don't know a lot about like his other stuff. So it's interesting that he's obviously carried on that tonality into something else that's probably more appropriate with more adult, older kind of things and things like that.
I think that with Hans Zimmer, his work in the 80s and 90s is very different to the sort of things that he's doing these days. That in the 21st century, his more modern soundtracks tend to be minimalist, and the music is more, there's an emphasis more on sonic textures than on melody. Whereas the music he did for stuff like The Lion King and The Power of One in the 90s is very melodic and stridently anthemic in a way.
Yeah. But I think that's really cool, because you can see like his evolution, but also maybe just him being interested in so many different things and being able to explore those interests in different films.
It's possible that it also comes from the collaborators that he had at the time. Yeah. I don't know much about Lebo M's other music, I have to confess. But so I'm not really sure how much of the soundtrack for The Power of One was, down to Zimmer, how much of it was down to Lebo M. But whoever came up with it, it's such an interesting, glorious fusion of different sort of world music elements. So I guess we should round things up by whatever's left on your list, because I've exhausted like my list of soundtracks pretty much.
I have The Loft Boys.
Oh yes.
Um, so The Lost Boys was actually the first one that I noted down. We talked again like a lot about it in the episode that we did, but I had to have it on the list because it's just again, I love music, I love soundtracks, and it's one of my favorite soundtracks for one of my favorite movies. It just flawlessly captures like the mood and like the spirit of like the gloom and grit of the 80s. You know, like it really captures like the punk subculture and like with like the mixture of like the rock, the goth, the pop, like new wave. I think it's just a prime example of getting all those elements right because you see a lot of like films now that they try and replicate that time period and try and use, you know, music of that decade and even your music now. It just doesn't fit. It just isn't right. But the music in the Lost Boys is amazing. And like the Echo and the Bunnymen's cover of The Doors, like People Are Strange, is so good. I'm gonna say it's better than the original. Oh no. It's amazing.
Well, one of the earlier episodes we did for this podcast was we talked about the film The Lost Boys at length, and we mentioned the soundtrack fleetingly.
Yeah.
I think one interesting thing about it is that there are a lot of like classic rock songs that get an 80s makeover on the soundtrack to this film.
Yeah.
A few that stick out in my mind. There's a cover of the Easy Beats song "Good Times" by Jimmy Barnes and In Excess, which I think is a real banger. I mean, you mentioned Echo and the Bunnymen's cover of The Doors, "People Are Strange." There's also Roger Daltrey of The Who does a cover of Elton John's "Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me." That's pretty good too.
Which is really cool because like the original songs but not songs that you'd think would be in this, but then it also shows that how flexible songs can be and how when people do certain covers they change the completely different feelings of songs and even the intention in a way.
I think they were probably chosen because the filmmakers probably thought that the lyrics fit with the emotional journey of the characters, but they decided to do an updated cover so that it fitted more with the youthful energy that the characters are supposed to have.
Yeah, and that new wave kind of vibe, I guess. One of the things I actually found was really cool that I only found out when I was sort of doing the episode of it. I was looking into things. Jared McMahon, who wrote Cry Little Sister, he actually wrote it before he saw the movie. So Jared McMahon, he wrote Cry Little Sister. So he was propositioned. He's like, we want to have a song for this movie. What song do you have? So he actually like wrote the song and then watched the movie. And then they were like, yeah, but that fits. So he was actually asked, you know, did you want to watch the movie, get a feel for it and stuff? And he's like, nah. So I find it really interesting that it just fits really well. So it's like he was commissioned to write it, but it wasn't as if like he didn't really know anything about it, really. He knew not much about the movie. He didn't really know about the other musicians who was going to be on it. He didn't really know anything else about, you know, the complete style of the film, but it just is perfect. Like, I think everyone knows Cry's Little Sister is, yeah, synonymous with the film.
That kind of reminds me of a story of like another soundtrack that I was thinking about, like talking about at length, but I won't at this stage. William Friedkin, when he was making a film called Sorcerer in the 1970s, he gave the script to German synthesizer group Tangerine Dream and said, can you write me a soundtrack for this film? So they wrote a complete soundtrack without having seen the film. They were just going off the script. And then William Friedkin went off and made the film Sorcerer, and a lot of the scenes were sort of, you know, cut, you know, to fit the music rather than the other way round. There was another couple of like fantasy movie soundtracks I was thinking about talking about on this episode, but I think it might be better if I wait till we do a whole episode on the film. The ones that I was thinking of was the film Legend from 1985. The original European cut of that film I think it was longer than the American cut. Anyway, the European cut featured an orchestral score by Jerry Goldsmith, and the American cut featured an electronic score by Tangerine Dream. And there's much sort of debate among fans of the film Legend as to which cut of the film is better and which score fits the movie better. My controversial opinion is I actually like both, which is not a popular view. But yeah, maybe we can talk about that more when we get around to talking about the film Legend itself, because I think it's something that deserves to be gone into in more depth then. Anyway, do you have one more soundtrack for us, or is that it?
Did I cover them all? I had The Lost Boys, Crow, Queen of the Damned, Donnie Darko, Candyman.
Yeah, that's 5. Yeah.
Yes. Can't think of anything else at the moment. No, I think I've covered the things that I was thinking of. But yeah, they're the music that really stand out to me in those films. They just stand out in the way where it's like I like them just as equally as the films. And the music is awesome.
Well, yes, they carry you away to another time and another place. And certainly when I listen to, some of the music that we've just been talking about, it's sort of, gives a lift to my spirit, I guess, especially, if I'm doing something incredibly dull at the time, like I'm washing dishes or, I'm, taking a long bus trip or something.
Yeah, well, that's what music does. It can change your mood. It can elevate it. It can manipulate it in a way, and it also depends on how you were feeling at that time. So, and I think, all the music that we've spoken about, it really does something to you. It really kind of enhances your experience, I think, of watching films. It's pretty cool, and not all music can do that. Oh, it's very good.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.